So, I don't know if I mentioned this in a previous video or not, but a Syrian minister last week basically claims that Syria is now going to take the Golan Heights. And you can find it in Jerusalem Post today. The article is titled, "How Seriously Should Israel Take Syria's Golan Heights Threat?" Experts said that the Syrian regime felt more confident about Syrian Foreign Minister Walid Muallim pledged that Syria would retake Golan Heights from Israel in his address to the UN General Assembly. I guess that story was posted yesterday. Syria's Foreign Minister Walid Muallim addressed the UN General Assembly on Saturday with a focus on what the regime intends to do about Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. He declared that Damascus aims to recapture the territory from Israel after Syrian regime forces have retaken areas opposite the Israeli border during a recent Russian-backed offensive. In recent months, the regime has captured most of the country after a bloody 7-year war that pitted pro-regime forces, including the regime's army, Russia, and Iran-backed groups like Hezbollah against anti-regime Sunni rebel fighters. The conflict has left more than 350,000 people dead, although estimates vary widely. The number could be closer to 500,000 and displaced millions. Aside from declaring Syria victorious in the war and praising the defiance of the Syrian people and the army, the foreign minister has also accused Israel of assisting terrorist organizations fighting the forces of Syrian President Bashar Assad. One common tactic of the regime is to refer to Israeli airstrikes in the Israeli airstrikes in Syria or Jerusalem support of rebel fighters as acts of terrorism. It reserves the same rhetoric for rebel groups, lumping them together with Islamic State or Al-Qaeda fighters who sided with the rebels during the war. And quite frankly, the Russians are doing this too, and even pro-Russian affiliates here in the United States are doing this. Israel has protected them, the terrorists, through direct military intervention and launching repeated attacks on Syria, Muallim declared. Just as we liberated southern Syria from terrorists, we are determined to liberate fully the occupied Syrian Golan to the lines of June 4, 1967, he added. Now, I think that's probably all I need to read here. I'll scroll down here a little bit. It said, at times, the Israeli governments have pondered returning the heights to Syria in exchange for peace and recognition. But with Iran's strong influence over the Assad regime, many analysts believe that Israel is more determined than ever now to keep a firm grasp on the Golan. Well, obviously. But does Israel now have a more determined enemy, and how seriously should Jerusalem take Muallim's words? I will say they should take him very, very seriously. During his speech, Muallim demanded that foreign forces deployed in Syria must leave. The U.S. currently has some 2,000 troops stationed in the country. Their role is to train and advise Kurdish and Sunni forces opposed to the regime. France also maintains some 1,000 troops there to assist anti-regime forces, while Turkey frequently intervenes from across the border. The irony to this is, there is an irony to this, because the only reason the Syrian regime has survived is because of the presence of foreign forces in Syrian soil that wanted to help it, namely Russia and Iran. The Syrian regime is no closer to retaking the Golan Heights than it has been since 1967, he asserted. Nothing has changed except for the mood of the regime. Assad hardly has an army, which brings me to the reason for Ezekiel 38. They're right. Assad hardly has an army, and that's the reason why Syria is not even mentioned in Ezekiel 38. Yet clearly, the northern army has to go through Syria in order to get to Israel, the Golan Heights, you see. So, as Russia adds more S-300, perhaps S-400 missile defense systems in Syria, the Assad regime, knowing that the more investment that Russia puts in Syria, the harder it is for Russia to be able to back out, and which builds their confidence. Now, there is one thing that I want to mention before I forget. You see, Russia has a long history of figuring out how to deal with different nationalities. You see, Russia occupies many nationalities, a whole bunch of them. In fact, I would dare say that Russia occupies more nationalities than there are in Europe. And among those are many, many Muslim provinces. Many of them. Turkic ethnic groups, different variations of Muslim ethnic groups. They think they know how to handle them, which is one of the reasons why they want to take over the Middle East. But the main reason why they want to take over the Middle East is because their, how do I say it? Their economy is 50% based on oil. That is extremely, extremely dangerous. That's the kind of things that would make a country like Russia do something extremely dangerous. Now, what I want to do is I'm just trying to over and over and over again remind everyone, please understand that Israel is the front line of World War III. Let me repeat myself. Israel is on the front line of World War III. While we sit back here in our houses, far, far away from all this, it will affect us here in the United States. So, bearing that in mind, that Israel is the front line of World War III, I want to remind everyone, I reminded everyone about the 6-Day War, and about how I think that at the time in the 6-Day War, Israel may have had like 16, I'm going to start saying doomsday weapons, because in Israel they don't use the term nukes for obvious reasons. So I will do the same. I will say doomsday weapons, if I can remember to do so. and they were willing to use it against Syria, even in 1973. So what I want to do is go to this UPI story. This is posted September 16, 2002. Yom Kippur, Israel's 1973 nuclear alert. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel came close to making a nuclear preemptive strike when it seemed to be facing defeat at the hands of Syrian armor, according to a half-dozen former U.S. diplomats and intelligence officials familiar with the still classified incident. Let me stop right there. Did you notice something here? Did you notice? See, you got to pay attention. That Israel was facing defeat at the hands of the Syrian army. We just read that the Syrian army is virtually nothing now. Which is why the Northern Army, written in Ezekiel 38, has to do Syria's dirty work. Now, I will continue. On October 5th, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year for Jewish people, the armies of Egypt and Syria attacked Israel from two directions and made rapid gains. According to a former senior U.S. diplomat, by October the 8th, Israel's Northern Front commander, Major General Yitzhak Hafez, had informed Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan that he couldn't hold out much longer against the 14,000 Syrian tanks. 14,000 Syrian tanks. Do you honestly think that Syria has that many tanks today? Rolling through Israel's defenses in where? The Golan Heights. The source, speaking on condition of anonymity, said that Dayan attacked by acute panic and declared to advisors this is the end of the Third Temple. But if Israel was to perish, it would take Damascus and Cairo with it. According to a former CIA official, who also spoke on condition of anonymity, Dayan sought an urgent meeting with Prime Minister Golda Meir and secured her authorization to arm 13 intermediate-range Jericho missiles with nuclear warheads, yes, doomsday weapons. 8 F-4 Phantom fighter aircraft were also to be given nuclear arms, according to senior U.S. officials. The meeting took place close to the Bor, Israel's huge underground war complex, these sources said. The predominant opinion today is that Israelis' first nuclear alert was a bluff, but an extremely dangerous one, a former senior State Department official said. The Israelis demanded an emergency airlift of weapons and spare parts from the United States to support an all-out war effort. And they accused then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger of deliberately withholding the resupply in order to allow the Arabs to gain ground. According to a source close to U.S. Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, the Israelis were right. Kissinger's strategy was to let Israel come out ahead but bleed, the sources said. What happened then was just possibly more frightening than anything else that has happened since World War II, according to former U.S. officials. Israel played a very, very dangerous game. I'm quoting them. No, the world played a dangerous game with Israel and nearly lost. And I'm telling you folks, the war is going to play a game with Israel one too many times and will lose in the future. And we came close to a nuclear war, said a former very senior State Department official with detailed knowledge of the incident. Over the next 3 days, the launchers were armed at Hirbat Zechariah, while the F-4s on 24-hour alert based in Tel Nof near Rehavat were also prepared, according to former senior Pentagon officials. The initial targets, these officials said, included the Syrian and Egyptian military headquarters, which were situated near Damascus and Cairo, respectively. In those days, Israel's nuclear arsenal was something U.S. diplomats and defense officials were taught not to even mention. To talk about Israel having nuclear weapons was a career-ending move, one source said. At that time, the Jerichos were deployed inside caves, inside Israel's military air bases that had huge blast doors, a former CIA official recalled Monday. The missile launchers were set up on the back of railway cars and could be rolled out, fired, and then rolled back, and blast doors closed, this official said. We thought of deploying the Mark III missile in the same way. Somehow an agent in place in Israel alerted the United States of arming of the Jerichos, and on October 12th, an SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft based at Beale Air Force Base in California took off, refueling out of Rota, Spain, and then flew over Syria, Jordan, and Israel. The plane, able to survey 100,000 square miles of land an hour, spotted the radiation from the missiles, according to a former Pentagon official and others familiar with the incident. According to this Pentagon source, Israel ordered the F-4s to shoot down the plane, but the Blackbird soared to 85,000 feet beyond the range of Israeli fighters. A former employee of Rockwell International, Richard Freeman, told the United Press International that the warhead of the Jericho was developed from the U.S. XW-58 warhead developed for the U.S. Army. It was about 24 inches long. Should be probably 24 feet long, I would say. I don't know why it says 24 inches long. But maybe it is 24 inches long. And it says in 18 to 20 inches in diameter, weighing 200 pounds. So I guess it was really small. Interesting. With an accuracy of 500 to 1,000 meters, the warhead was designed for airburst above population centers or massed armor formations. But a former CIA official added, the thing had a lot of problems with its guidance system, and we weren't sure if deployment was real or just saber rattling. Saber rattling or not, the same day, the United States began a huge airlift to Israel, including ammunition tanks and aircraft. Israel made dramatic battlefield gains on all fronts, until on October 14, UN Security Council approved ceasefire brought the fighting to a halt. But then, Israel's current prime minister back then in 2002, Ariel Sharon, who was at the time a major general commanding a division, broke the ceasefire and began to encircle the Egyptian Third Army, opening the way to Cairo. It was the Soviets' turn to panic. According to a half a dozen former State Department officials, diplomats, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev told the United States he might be forced to send in crack troops to back up Egyptian forces defending Cairo. There was plenty of intelligence that elite Soviet paratroop units were on alert and moving. To halt Sharon, Kissinger raised a state of alert of all the U.S. defense forces worldwide, calling DEFCONs. For defense condition, they work in descending order from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 1, which is war. Kissinger ordered a DEFCON 3. According to a former senior State Department official, the decision to move to DEFCON 3 sent a clear message that Sharon's violation of the ceasefire was dragging us into a conflict with the Soviets, and it also warned the Soviets that the United States wasn't playing around, by the way, and that we had no desire to see the Egyptian army destroyed. I'm not sure that I am. Anyway, I'll continue. Israel, which had canceled its nuclear alert, went on nuclear alert for a second time until Meir quickly ended the crisis by ordering her army to stop all offensive actions against the Egyptians. But the same State Department official pointed out something that has always been a major deterrent in the Middle East. If Tel Aviv had used those weapons, most of the fallout would have blown back on Israel because of the pattern of prevailing winds at the time. Which brings me back to Ezekiel 38 and 39. You see, folks, the war that's written in Ezekiel 38, specifically here, What does it say? Who does it say that Israel must declare war with? Does it say Syria? No, it does not. Okay. So we got a little timeline here. Verse 18. It shall come to pass in that time, when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith Jehovah Elohim, that my fury shall come up in my face, for in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel, so that the fishes of the sea, and the fowls of the heaven, and the beasts of the field, and all the creeping things upon the land, and all the men that are on the face of the land, that's in the Golan Heights, shall shake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. Now here's what it says. Now this is where it gets interesting. And I will call for a sword against him. Against who? Against God. What do you mean a sword? This is a declaration of war. All out war. Throughout all my mountains, says Jehovah Elohim, every man's sword shall be against his brother. Now it says, now I will judge him with pestilence, with blood, and I will rain upon him and upon his armies, and upon the many people that are with him, that are coming, invading the land, and overflowing rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. Now, and of course, everyone will know at that particular point in time that the power of heaven intervened. They will know this. Israel will know this too. And they will know that at this point they will have the upper hand. Now, if we go to the next chapter, 39, something a little different is said about the lands of Magog and those who dwell carelessly at the coastlands of the Mediterranean Sea. Those who dwell on the coastlands of the Mediterranean Sea, aka Roman nations, have been Israel's enemy for over 2,000 years. Now, it says in verse 6 of Ezekiel 39, and I will send blood, hailstone. That's not what it says. You see, the blood, hailstones, fire, and brimstone that's going to come out of heaven is going to fall down on the troops that are invading the land of Israel. And the great earthquake is going to swallow many of this army up. But then what happens? I will send a fire on Magog. I want to make sure that I know what the word send means, and make sure that I've got the right meaning here. To send. There's all kind of different meanings in it, but many of them are send. Like send you away, send away, sending, sending, sending. Okay, that's most of them. All right? Now, if you go to number 1, way down here in a Brown Driver Briggs, it is send, human subject especially. Now, which brings me to, if you read in the previous wars, that Israel was, at most of the time, with the exception of the Battle of Jehoshaphat, most of the time Israel was ordered to carry out missions, to actually go to war. You can read it in Judges, Samuel, even in Exodus, and especially the book of Joshua. Okay? Especially the book of Yehoshua. Now, and when it says that he shall call upon us, call a sword against Gog in all his mountains, that means Israel will have to declare war against the northern army. Now, how is little tiny Israel going to declare war against this great big thing up north? Fire is going to fall on the land of Magog. And when you read Revelation 9, you will see in verse 18, by these three was the third part of men killed, by fire, by smoke, by brimstone, which issued out of their mouths, for their power is in their mouth and in their tail. And if you read this carefully, you will notice that it appears to be saying that the power is directed from the mouth to the tail. Because it says, for their tails were like unto serpents, and had heads, and with them they do hurt. So the head and the tail work together, and the power, or and it looks like they have warheads on the tails, and with them they do hurt. Now, this is on the sixth trumpet sound, so clearly nuclear war. 1/3 of mankind, clearly nuclear war has already taken place in the sixth trumpet sound. Okay? But as I'm going back to what I said earlier in this video, Israel is the front line of the coming world war. So, expect Israel to have to launch nukes. Now, I've been saying this over and over again for quite a while. And I hope people don't get tired of hearing it. But I have another theory. Russia has been sowing chaos in the United States of America since the Iron Curtain fell upon Europe. Okay? And they have never stopped, except for one brief moment with Boris Yeltsin. But soon after Boris Yeltsin quit the presidency of Russia and Vladimir Putin was installed, the chaos, the sowing of chaos and confusion by Russia against the United States gradually came back, and it came to a fever pitch 2 years ago when the elections took place 2 years ago. Well, I can tell you that it's even worse right now. And the most opportune time for Russia to pull this stunt. Now, don't forget, Russia has done things like this before. The the invasion of Crimea coincided with, I believe it was, the Olympics. Let's look it up. Okay, so The Guardian, back in August 10, 2016, did an article. And, well, they had a theory, but it doesn't appear like the theory came true. But their article says Vladimir Putin may believe the time is ripe for another invasion. The Crimea crisis has come from nowhere, but the Russian president has formed for military adventures on Olympic years, says Luke Harding. In other words, I don't need to read this whole article. You got the gist of what I was trying to say. Vladimir Putin has a history of using distractions as a way to invade. He did it in the Sochi, was it? I want to make sure that I know it was at the Olympics. So Olympics in 2014. So it was at Olympics in 2014. You can go look it up for yourself. What I'm trying to tell you is, folks, Russia has already shown by their actions in 1967 that they're willing to invade Israel, right? And if you don't believe it, then you need to read the article in The Guardian that 1967 and Armageddon. How the 6-Day War almost led to Armageddon, The Guardian. Please read it if you have not read it already. And if you have read it, read it again. Because the Russians indeed had planned on invading Israel and actually launching nukes on Israel, which, folks, the Israelis know this. Israelis can't launch an army at the Russians, but they have at least 200 doomsday weapons. And some of them are stronger than the type that were used in Japan. Now, why in the world? And don't forget, folks, don't forget that Israel would not have to worry about the prevailing winds that they had to worry about in Syria. You see? Now, going back to the 10 toes, the 10 kings written about in Revelation, why would they then have the guts, the temerity, the intestinal fortitude to then try to come and fight against Israel's newly crowned king, after this had already been done to Russia? Because it is very likely that Israel may have used its last nuke Russia. Think about it.